so today we'll be looking at the next poem by Rosemary Dobson. So not in any particular order, but we'll be looking at Cockcrow. It was a poem that was published in 1965, so when Dobson was around 45 years old. It deals with Dobson's experience of motherhood, and in the poem there is evidently tension between selfhood and familial obligations that she must uphold in regards to her role as a mother. So some links to the human experience that we can identify would be identity, obligation, selfhood, motherhood, familial relationships, guilt, and shame. Now, before we move on into a stanza by stanza analysis, these are the key things that I want you to keep in mind in regards to macro techniques or like the bigger techniques that are sustained throughout the poem. So the first thing that I want you to make note of is that there is kind of like a plot or like a storyline that we are following in regards to this poem, and we need to identify the fact that the persona is a mother, and we start off with her going out for a walk, and while she is on a walk she is reflecting upon her life, and then at the end of the poem we see her return back home. So basically what you need to think about is what prompted her to go on that walk and what is she reflecting upon as she is on that walk. That's something that we will unpack very soon. But some macro or like stylistic features that you might want to keep in mind of would be that it's written in 5 stanzas, and in each stanza we have 4 lines. And it's following somewhat of a rhyming scheme of the A, B, C, B. So by having somewhat of a formal structure that we are following, there is a sense of regularity that is being upheld. So what is that? Or what the regularity is achieving is that it is enhancing a sense of predictability of the persona's life. So here, as I've written, so the predictability is referring back to the idea of like the repeated routine as a mother. So like the daily routine or the daily life that she is living is one that is very repetitive. Another thing that I want you to pay attention to is the title Cockcrow. So literally, like in the literal meaning, it would mean that like a rooster is calling. But figuratively, what you need to keep in mind of is that it is a biblical allusion to Jesus, predicting Peter's betrayal of him 3 times. So essentially, underlying this poem is the idea of guilt, betrayal. Now let's have a look at the poem stanza by stanza. So the first line, wanting to be myself alone. Wanting. So the diction here is indicating that she wants to be alone. So she doesn't want to be held down by any other relationship, but she wants to be alone. Or you could talk about the diction of alone here as well. Between the lit house and the town. So something that you could think about here is the house and town. They are symbolic. And firstly, the house is symbolic of the domestic realm. The town is of the social realm. So essentially, she's stuck between the obligations as a mother within the domestic sphere in regards to the expectations that are being posed onto mothers by the society. And she's between the house and the town. That means that she is, again, stuck in a liminal space. I took the road and at the bridge turned back and walked the way I'd come. So firstly, I want you to make note of this idea of how it's using personal pronoun, right? So I took the road. So it's going back to this idea of how it's a confessional poetry. The persona is confessing to us something. It's very personal. Something that you could also make note of, it's not only in this particular stanza, but have a look at how there is a lot of use of the word and. So and. So the repeated conjunction. It's capturing the fragmented psyche of the persona. as she is stuck between her position, role as a mother versus herself. So another thing that you could make note of is turning back and walk the way it comes. So the imagery of her taking the road and at the bridge turning back and walking the way I'd come, it's sort of capturing this idea of hesitation. So she's not like, okay, I'm just gonna leave my kids and I'm never gonna come back. It's not like a easy decision that she needs to make, but it's quite difficult and she's very hesitant about leaving the house. Although she feels extremely claustrophobic, extremely restricted within that confine or within the confines of her own home, under the obligations that she has as a mother, she's still hesitant because there's responsibility that she needs to uphold. Now let's move on to stanza 2. So we start off with the naphra of 3 times. So here it's the biblical allusion to Jesus or Christ having been revived on the 3rd day. But what I want you to make note in particular here is that she's taking the lonely stretch and the dark trees are closing me round 3 times. So this is suggesting that it's not only once. So she's not in this kind of dilemma once in her life. It's not like a one-time thing, but it's been a repeated kind of thing where she's sort of like, I should leave and I want to leave all my obligations, responsibilities behind and live my life as me. But then she recalls all the obligations and the responsibilities that she has and she can't truly just, leave everything behind. So it's a cycle that she's in where she keeps on wanting to leave, but she's struggling to leave and it keeps on going back and forth. The night absolved me of my bonds. That's a metaphor and it's also a personification. So you need to make note of essentially how the night is absolving me of my bonds, i.e. it is freeing her. It is liberating her from the obligations and the responsibilities that are coming with the familial bonds that she has with her daughter or her relationship with other family members. Now, in stanza 3, I want you to make note of how in the first line, we have my mother and my daughter slept. So we have the possessive pronoun. So she has somewhat of a relationship, a strong relationship, a personal relationship with her mother and her daughter. One life behind and one before. So we kind of have parallelism here, right? Like my mother and my daughter, one life behind and one before. And I want you to have a look at, technique wise, it's a diacope here, but I want you to make note of this diagram here that I've given you. So she is stuck in between her mother and her child, so her daughter. So you need to make note of her inability or the emotional difficulties or the psychological difficulties that she's facing in having to negotiate the different identities that are imposed upon her. The different obligations that are imposed upon her because of the different identities that she must uphold in society. So in particular circumstances, she'll be a mother. In particular circumstances, she'll be herself. And in particular circumstances, she would also be a daughter to a mother, right? So the inability to kind of negotiate that kind of tension in which she's all of them, right? All of the identities are associated with her. But at the same time, they can't exist or they somehow cannot exist at the same time. There are different roles and obligations that are being imposed onto her. Depending on the particular identity that you are presenting yourself to uphold in particular circumstances. And here we have their needs in shutting to the door. So I want you to make note of how this is quite symbolic. It's a symbolic act of her rejecting the responsibilities and the obligations that are being imposed onto her. Now, at the beginning, I've mentioned the repeated use of and, right? So that's something that is sustained throughout the poem. So, and walking up and down the road. Let me do that again. So and and what I want you to make note of here is the imagery of her walking up and down the road. You need to make note of the fact that, like, if you are walking up and down the road, you're not like set on a particular destination, but you seem quite reluctant, or you seem quite hesitant, of hesitation. And we have this idea of loneliness, alienation, and pain that is achieved through the lexical chain, right? So separate, alone, cries, pain. So you need to make note of here. It's a metaphor, right? You need to make note of how there is this tension again between, like, you're not completely rejecting your position as a mother, or you're not rejecting your identity as like a daughter or a mother, and only prioritizing your identity as an individual, because like all of them are you. It's just like the difficulty in negotiating that tension. So what you need to make note of is it's talking about the painful experience. So the suffering that is associated in recognizing that there is love that grows about the burn. So that's unconditional familial love. So its intention. It's not that you don't like your child. It's not that you don't like your mom. It's not that you don't like anyone in your family. It's more like you love them and it's unconditional, and the love for them is so great. However, it's still imposing a lot of like tension, or a lot of like suffering, or a lot of emotional instability upon you. Now we are at the final stanza. Now we have two brief allusions. So we have exclamatory language. And what this exclamatory language, or this exclamation, is trying to do is it's trying to kind of break the moment in which it's sort of like she was in her head, she was reflecting, and now she's like back into the reality. Thrice, for me, remember like the biblical reference that is being repeated, right? So like the number 3 is being repeated throughout. So we have like thrice, three times at the beginning. I had the cockcrow on the hill. So we have this idea, well, we have the titular reference. And if they are crying, or like if they are crowing on the hill, that's sort of like going back to the motif of dawn, because they don't usually cry in the middle of the night, or like at like 10 p.m. It's usually in the morning or at dawn that they start crying or crowing. And the motif of dawn, so you need to make note of how this is like suggestive of new beginnings, right? But you could also make note of the fact that it's quite ironic, because when she is returning back home, is it a really new beginning? Was it a new beginning? It's probably not. She's returning back to what she's already used to. She's returning back to the repetitive daily life that she must endure, and that she had so hoped to escape. So it is a motif to new beginnings. It is a repeated reference to like new beginnings and stuff like that. However, it's quite ironic. And then we have this idea of, and turn the handle of the door. So we have the symbolic act of her turning the handle of the door and actually going back into the house. Again, you need to make note of how she is going back into the domestic realm. So she's going back in. I.e. the domestic sphere. That she feels so claustrophobic in. Like she doesn't really enjoy it, right? So like she's feeling so restrictive, or she feels so restricted under the obligations and responsibilities that she must uphold as a mother, yet she re-enters that particular environment. And the next line is, thinking I knew his meaning well. So the diction of thinking, it's adding to the uncertain tone of the ending of the poem, in which it's sort of like she's not sure She cannot be sure if she's making the right decision in going back inside the house. However, because of her responsibility, because of the unconditional love that she holds for her family, she's going back in, ready to, relive the repetitive daily life that she had so desired to escape. So you need to make note of like the tension that exists between selfhood and motherhood, and almost how it's often unnegotiable because the love for the child often supersedes the prioritization of your own selfish personal desires. So this is today's writing task. What ideas on guilt in the human experience does Cockcrow explore? Remember, as we always do, you need a topic sentence, you need 3 to 4 analyses, and a concluding sentence. And remember that you must narrow your idea down as well. So like you're not only talking about guilt, but you're tying it in with like the broader themes of motherhood, selfhood, responsibilities, and whatnot. So that is it for today's video, and I'll see you guys again later. So that is it for today's video, and I'll see you guys soon.